joined us, or those of you who are listening online later in the day. I'm Peggy Kendall. This is Matt Scott. Matt, hey, good. Thank you so much. I think we've got some really good things to share today, and we're excited to get started. So let's start by talking about who we are. Matt, do you want to start?
That'd be great. Thanks, Peggy. Are we getting a little feedback on that or not?
Okay. We're good.
So I am a consultant with TurningWest. I have a background in law and finance and executive leadership, helping teams and organizations get clear on who they are and what they're doing. And in that background, I have a lot of experience addressing crowds with messages on a regular basis. So I'm excited to be with y'all today and talk more about presentations.
Thank you. And I am Dr. Peggy Kendall. I'm a senior consultant at TurningWest. I've been here for about 2 years, but my other job is a professor at Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I am in the communication studies department, and I have been teaching public speaking for well over 30 years. I know it's hard to believe, but I've been teaching public speaking for a long time. I've been working with leaders, with lots of different kinds of people. I started in, teaching middle school kids, and I've done senior citizen things. I mean, I've talked about public speaking to a lot of people. So I'm really excited about this topic today because I think I'm not sure that necessarily just this presentation is going to change your life, but I think public speaking is one of those life-change experiences. So I think it really, really is important. All right. So, Matt, we're both public speakers. We speak all over the place. What could possibly go wrong?
What would possibly go wrong? I think most of the time when I show up for public speaking, I'm afraid of a few things. One, I'm going to show up in the wrong place. Two, I'm going to be talking about the wrong thing. Three, I'm going to address the crowd wrong. I saw a commercial the other day where the rock band comes out and goes, yeah, and they're all welcoming. And he says, hello, Seattle. And then they say, Seattle was last week. But I think it's funny that they're, it's kind of like the saying that people tend to be more afraid of dying than of speaking, or they tend to be more afraid of speaking in front of other people than of dying. And I think there's just so many different things that we can be terrified of when it comes to speaking in front of people.
All right, let me give you an example. So I think one of my worst experiences, I've had plenty, but this is one that just won't leave my mind. I was hired for this youth conference to be a speaker about social media, because that's what I was researching at the time. And so it was at a college, right? At a university. So I'm like, all right, they're going to be sitting in desks, and I'll have my little PowerPoint, and they'll be taking notes. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking of. I get there, and they're like, oh, no, you're over here in the gym. And I'm like, the gym? Oh, that's really interesting. I wonder what we're going to do there. And I walk in, there's like lights, and these kids are screaming and bopping up and down, and the music is so loud, and they're like, ah! And then they're like, and now it's Peggy, and everyone's screaming. And so people always say, hey, start with a joke. So I started with a joke, and all of a sudden, all that chaos and pandemonium and noise was like nothing. There was like nothing. And they all just looked at me because they didn't get my joke. And then the worst part was I had another 30 minutes that I had to talk to them. And it was like so bad. So why do we start with like a bad experience of public speaking? Because there's so many things that we get worried about. I mean, there's like, what are people going to think of me? If my message is really important to me, are they going to get it? Are they going to remember it? Or are they going to walk away thinking, oh, that person doesn't really know what they're talking about? Or even worse, Are they going to sit there and think to themselves, this was the most boring presentation I've ever heard, and I just want to get out of here? No one wants to be boring, right? So this is an important question for me. Let me just tell you a little bit about my public speaking journey. I started in middle school. I'm this tall, skinny kid who worried about everything. I played the bass clarinet in the junior high band, and the bass clarinet was bigger than me. And it was like, all I wanted to do is just fade into the background. I took my first public speaking course, and I don't know what it was, but for the first time, I realized I had a voice and people wanted to hear what I had to say. And it was that experience that made me feel like, you know what? I am important. What I have to say is important. And so I have spent literally the last 30 years listening to probably thousands of speeches, many of them not so good, because I have seen when someone begins to find their voice and feel more and more confident in the way that they present themselves in a public situation, they develop confidence from top to bottom. And I think the skills that work for a speech that you can really work on and hone are also the same kind of skills that are going to help you become a better communicator. So personally, this is a really important topic. Anything else you want to add, Matt?
I love it. I think finding your voice is critical. And then I think having the courage to share it is big, but a lot of this is going to come from practice. So
yeah.
Right.
All right. So the two things hopefully that you're going to leave here today with: A, you're going to figure out how to make your messages stick. And we're going to talk about what stickiness means. And the second one is that you will walk away with some keys to how you can figure out how to connect with your audience in a way that's authentic for you, and not something that's just some cookie cutter sort of thing. All right. So I just wanted to start. I've used a number of these books in my classes, working with people, but I'll tell you what, this Made to Stick book, I've been using it this year, and man, there's good stuff in here, and I really like it. I'm using it all the time. So I would highly recommend Heath and Heath's Made to Stick book. Dale Carnegie's Art of Public Speaking is sort of like a classic. These other ones I think are also good. They've got good things to say. All right. This is where we're going for the next 30 minutes. We're going to talk about how to make your messages sticky. And sticky means that, first of all, people are going to pay attention to it and get it. But also, once they leave, I mean, it's kind of sad to think that you put all this work into a presentation. When people leave, they forget most of it. Well, you want those messages that are important to stick, right? You want people to think about them and to remember them after you're done speaking. So these are some sticky strategies that are going to help kind of pep up your presentations, get people paying attention, and also is going to help people remember what you have to say. Simplify, visualize, and connect. So we are hopefully we can sort of model some of these things that we're presenting. So with these 3 points, the first thing we're going to talk about is simplifying things.
One of the things we like to talk about is ruthless prioritization, how we are getting clear on what we really want to talk about. One of the things Peggy likes to discuss is pushing our students to get it down just to, this is the core thing we're talking about. One of my mentors in speaking would always say, at the top of your speech, you should be able to write it out in one sentence what your talk is about. And until you get to that one sentence, you're not focused enough yet on what you're saying. You don't clearly understand it. And that's a practice I continue to use to this day. And my favorite is when someone will ask me, what's your talk about, Matt? And if I can't give it in one clear, concise sentence, then I don't understand it. What we want to be able to get down to is one core idea that we're focusing on. Because if we're clear on what that idea is, everything in the talk flows from that. We know that our stories, our examples, our highlights, our points, everything flows up to this one big idea. Until we're clear on what that one big idea is, the talk's going to be scattered and all over the place.
Right. And I think, especially in business, oh my gosh, especially in business, I've seen this. We have so many things that we want to cover. But honestly, people are not going to be able to pay attention to so many things. You got to figure out what is the core thing, right? And you should be able to say it in a short sentence and say it a number of times throughout your speech. And I think this is true for training too. In my classes, what I've tried to do is, it's a whole semester of classes, but I figure out like the class that that I'm teaching right now. It's like, all right, two words, every single speech, 2 words. Is it concrete and is it simple? And I use those words over and over again. And that's the key thing, because they'll remember some of the things that they did, but in their minds, that's going to stick when you can kind of boil it down into this one big idea. The other thing that I think is important, maybe it's just because I've been teaching speech for so long, but I think you need to have a clear outline. Because if you are just going to talk and talk and talk, it's like, all right, I kind of have an idea what I'm going to do, and I'm just going to talk. You know what that's called? Boring. It's called boring because people just ramble, right? And it might be kind of fun to sit there and talk and ramble, but it's not fun to listen to. So here's the deal. We tend to think in terms of chunks, right? So we can only remember about 5 pieces of information at a time. So when we have a bullet list of 10 things, it's like, who's going to remember that? I'll tell you what, nobody. So let me give you an example. When we're reading, we have these visual cues that help us chunk things. This is an article I wrote. Thank you. But if I were to tell you, like, can you please, like, process this? You'd be like, no way, I don't even know where to start. This is like, it doesn't make any sense to me, right? But when we're reading, we have these visual cues, right? So like paragraphs is like a visual cue. It's like, I think I froze. Did I freeze?
We got you.
Okay. So we have these visual cues that tell us here's a chunk and here's a chunk, right? But something like this is even chunkier. It's like sometimes we have headlines, sometimes we have titles, chapters, and something like this is like, wow, I can remember that. That's simplified, right? So that happens in a book automatically because that's something visual. But when we're just talking, it's like blah, blah, blah. It's just like a whole string of words. So you got to chunk it up. And one of the ways to do that, I think, is a clear outline, making sure that the points are short and like the titles of the points are short and sweet, right? You finish one point. So my point might be simplify. My next point might be visualize. And I am going to do 3 things. First of all, I'm going to internally summarize what I just said. So, being simple is so important, but that's not the only thing. See, that's a transition. Helping people visualize what you're saying is also important. So that's an example of internal summaries, transitions, signposting. Now all of a sudden, in my mind, I've just chunked up what you said. So that helps to simplify how we do things. Anything else, Matt?
I love it. And I think the verbal signposting is so key for a talk. Just the fact that, if you can use slides like we're talking about in here, you can give people those visual cues, but also letting them know verbally, hey, point number 1, point number 2, point number 3, give them an idea of a framework for where they are. It really helps them track and remember that.
The next thing I just want to talk about, this is has become like my soapbox The thing that bothers me the most in my life, which is a bad slide deck. I have seen such good speakers. They're like powerful. They're like, they connect with their audience. They're so interesting. And as soon as they turn on their PowerPoint, it's like the whole audience just kind of sighs and checks out. And usually the speaker checks out too. So I know we have to use slide decks. I get that. But we can do them well. Here's this. I say this in my classes all the time. And, you know, they might not remember anything that I teach them, but they will remember this. Bullet points will suck your soul. If you get excited about something, as soon as you turn on the PowerPoint and start reading your slides, that's it. It's like you have gone from an exciting presentation to a boring presentation. So let me unpack that just a little bit. All right. So this is so typical of business presentations that I see. And when I see something like this pop up, I'm like, no. Anyway, first of all, it's a template from the 80s, right? The 80s called, they want their template back. All right. So get rid of the old template, right? Then the second problem, who's going to read all this stuff? Like there's all these words. In fact, I don't need you, the speaker. Just get out of my way. I'll just read it, right? That's a lot easier. Look at all of those chunks. So if I put up this slide and I start on the first bullet point, all I can think about is how many more bullet points do I have? This is going to be awful. And it's like just a list. And what do you do with a list? Nobody likes lists. So a couple of things you got to think about. There's different ways instead of bullet points. This is like 2024. Get rid of the bullet points. We don't need them anymore. You can use like smart art on PowerPoint, right? Get rid of all the words. Just use one or two key words, right? Instead of smart art, you can use visualizations or just like one slide per idea. But a whole list, especially if we can only remember like 5 chunks of information at a time, what's going to happen here? By the time you get down to the bottom, I have no idea what you said at the beginning. So, oh, my slide didn't work. Shoot, I worked a long time on that slide. It says bullet points underneath there. So instead of all those bullet points on that one slide, I could just have a visual that hopefully would work that says no bullet points, right? It communicates the same thing. And if I'm a good speaker, I'm telling you with my words all of the things that you need to know. Oh, okay. One other thing. So I know in business, it's data. Data is super important. Numbers, lots of people like numbers. Numbers can be a little bit boring and overwhelming. I think we can all agree on that. So let's say you have to go through the information, right? But here's the thing. A chart, a graph should tell a story. Your numbers should tell a story. And just putting up a bunch of numbers on there and letting people trying to figure out what the story is not helpful. So you have something like this and it's like, FYI, I just made up this information. So like FYI. But there's so much going on here. It's hard for the audience to focus. And while they're trying to focus, they quit paying attention to you a long time ago. Now, something like this, it's the same information, but I've highlighted things. So I'm beginning to tell a story with my numbers. In fact, something like this would actually probably be more helpful. So when you've got graphs, when you got a lot of numbers, please simplify things down to the clearest way that you can present your story using numbers. And if you have to get a lot of things on a graph, think about either doing a number of different graphs or building each piece of information on there. Yeah.
Hey, I had a question on that last slide. If you can go back to it.
Yes.
Amazing speakers only use one bullet point. Are you the amazing speaker in that test?
No, because when I put 0, it didn't show up.
I noticed you only had one bullet point in your whole talk. So.
It's pretty good.
Thanks.
Okay. Anything else with simplify, Matt?
Yeah, I think until you've got it down to one nugget of what you're really focusing on, I think there's a thing that we tend to do, and I fight it myself. We want to say so much,
Right.
and people can't handle that much. And so the simplification process, while it feels like you're getting less,
Yes.
you're actually giving the listener more by being simple and succinct and focused. And so you see, I even have trouble saying that as one word. I have to say it 3 different ways. But narrowing it down to what you're actually saying really actually gives the people more takeaway.
That's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. The next thing that is really emphasized in Heath and Heath's book, Made to Stick, is this idea of making things concrete and visual. Because in many ways, we are visual thinkers. That's how we remember things, that's how we process things. So why not use that piece of information to make our presentations more interesting? So this is something, I don't know, some of you might have heard of it before. It's called the abstraction ladder. And one of the things that makes presentations so boring is when people talk on a really high level. And I see this in businesses all the time. They use a lot of business jargon, like there's a lot of synergy when we're working together as a team. And it's like, I don't even know what that means, right? So when you're really high level, people check out after a while. What's going to make it concrete is when you bring it down, kind of ground it a little bit more. So you've got this abstraction ladder. And basically, I could talk about how important animals are in our lives. And, that would be kind of interesting. I could talk about how important a pet is. Or you should think about getting a dog. Or you could get a small dog like a Morkie. Or how about this? I could tell you an example of my dog named Piper, who is a Morkie, and how she's influenced my life. All of a sudden, I can see Piper the Morkie, right? I can see that. Animal, pet, kind of. That's a little more abstract. You want to make things stick. You have to make them visual and you have to make them concrete. Anything else with that, man?
I think when you are that specific, it comes to life because you're not just telling a hypothetical, you're talking about an actual thing. I mean, there's something storytellers talk about: use a world you already know. Don't try and create a whole nother world. Even if it's totally different, base it on something that's familiar. So by being this specific, you're going into detail about something that actually exists. And as much as it's real for you, it becomes real for your audience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one thing I do, especially in training, is whenever I make a point, I give an example, because examples not only clarify what I was saying, but once again, it makes it visual, and that's what people are going to remember, and that helps people sort of process what they're trying to understand. Stories. I mean, I think we all know this, right? Good public speakers tell stories because, as Walter Fisher says, our lives are a narrative, right? And you've become part of my narrative. Like there's a whole bunch of theories having to do with that. But stories is one beautiful way to make things come to life. Matt, you want to tell us more about how you use stories?
Yeah, I think it also makes the speaker personal. By you showing up and sharing a little bit about yourself, one of the things we like to say is vulnerability begets vulnerability. So as you show your authentic self and tell stories from your own lives, it allows people in and it feels like they're getting to know you, and then they feel connected to you. I'm always shocked how connected we feel to a speaker after we hear them talk. And we might not even be in the room with them, but we feel like we know them. There's a guy I listened to his podcast and I watched the video of it. And when I finally met him, I was like, oh, there he is. And I felt like I knew him. And afterwards I thought, I have literally never met that person before in my life. I'd never even been in the same room with him. But by hearing him speak and hearing stories of his life, I felt very connected to him. And stories can paint, like we're saying, they can paint a picture and help people visualize. It also helps people connect on an emotional level. It
Yeah.
helps them feel, it helps them experience what's going on in your life. And when you're open and vulnerable in that way, they can connect with you. I saw this great speaker last month. He came in to an audience he had never spoken to before. They didn't know him. They didn't have a background with him. They weren't familiar with his writing, anything like that. So before he got into the content of his speech, he talked about who he was. He shared a personal story from his family for almost 20 minutes. It was an hour-long session, and he spent 20 minutes, a third of the time, just telling us who he was. And at the end of that story, he said, "Sorry for the side story, but I realized before I got here tonight, you and I don't know each other. We haven't spent time together. So I wanted to give y'all an understanding of who I am. And now I feel like that I've shared this. Now when we see each other, we can give each other a big hug because we've kind of walked this journey a little bit together." And then he started on his content. And by then we were hooked. I mean, he had this powerful story about growing up with parents who were both deaf, and how he dealt with that and how he helped them and what that meant to his life and how that led to a life in speaking, because he was always speaking on behalf of his family. And then when he left home for the first time to go to college, he realized later that they didn't have anyone to speak for them. It was very emotional. People are literally crying. And that opened us up to then hear from him and really listen to what he says. So taking that time to do that kind of thing is big. As you talked about, I love the Aristotle comment, allows people to become part of your narrative. They become actively involved in your life. It's inviting them in. It's drawing them in and giving them a chance to take part. And then it makes it where it's, like you said, not too abstract. These stories have specific time and place. We can see you going to this thing and imagine ourselves there. It's like when you talk about the university where you work, you don't say generally, I went to work in this. I've realized over time, you drop these little context markers where you say, oh, I was over at the bookstore, and then I went up to my office, and I was down, and you describe what that's like, to where now when you talk about Bethel, I feel like I understand the campus, and I feel like I'm there. So those specifics in the story help draw us in to kind of know where we're going. The other thing I want to highlight on that is being aware of who your audience is and what they know. There's a great story of Steve Martin getting up to do a stand-up bit, and he's about 3 minutes in, and he said, "It's my understanding that there are a lot of plumbers in town." And all these plumbers clap. There's this big plumbers convention. Steve Martin found out about that ahead of time and then prepared all these plumber-specific jokes for them. But by bringing up a story in relation to our people that they can personally identify with, that they can see themselves in, we're in a sense entering their world and allowing them to enter ours. So by being considerate and using examples they know, we make this talk that much more accessible.
Beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. And man, I think we all know how important storytelling is. And it's interesting. Sometimes when I'm teaching, I say, we're going to do some business speeches next. And I'm going to want you to work on being professional. And they're the most boring speeches of the whole time. And it's like, wait, professional is not boring. People who are in organizations and in business, they like hearing stories too, and stories help bring these concepts to life. So I would say you want your presentations to come alive and to stick with people. You tell a story, give examples, visualize, those kinds of things. And a week later, someone will say, well, what do you remember about that presentation? And I'll bet you that they will tell you the story that you said.
When we facilitate, when Peggy and I in our company will go and do facilitations with teams, and when we're with a team for a whole day, I'll spend a little more time introducing myself, and I'll actually have a slide of my family. So when I start talking, I don't start talking and say, I'm Matt Scott, and these are the degrees I have, and this is why you should listen to me. I literally start with, this is my 5-year-old daughter and my 3-year-old son, and this is my wife, like hugging them. Because it shows them who I am, it personalizes me, and it helps them get an insight into my life. Another way I tend to introduce myself is I say, I was born and raised in San Antonio. I'm the middle of 3 boys, because at some point in the day, I'm going to tell a story that talks about like all the stuff we broke in the house, or the day we knocked over my mom's statue with the playing basketball in the house, which we weren't supposed to, and how it shattered the statue, and how my mom like glued it back together. Like these kind of things. And then, like you're saying, afterwards, people's response is, what happened with the statue? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I think they're going to come up to ask content on the talk, and they're like, we want to know what happened with the statue. Like, did your mom go nuts? Like, what, it's like we pushed her to the brink of sanity, and then we broke the statue. It's like, what happened? And they, like you said, they want to connect with you as a person. They want to get to know you, which brings us to the next point.
Well, and I think one other thing about stories too is we can be we can put our defenses up pretty quickly. If someone's going to tell me something that I think I already know or I don't need to know, I can get fairly defensive when I'm listening, and I listen in a whole different way. If they start telling me a story that sort of communicates some of those same values or things that I'm hoping to have people adopt different behaviors, it kind of comes in under the radar, right? So a good story is going to take what you've been telling people and put it in a different kind of package so that they can remember it and be much more open to the content of the things that you're trying to say.
Our preaching professor would always say, I was the one in our group who told the stories. And I said, what does that mean? He said, in a group, when you're sitting around, you're telling stories, usually there's one go-to person for the story. I thought, okay. And he said, I was the go-to person for the stories, to the point where his friends would ask him to tell their stories because he told stories so well. And as we went on the class, we got to know all these different stories. And by the end, you're like, oh, I feel like I know this guy. It's personalized him. We've connected. And then those defenses go down, like you're saying.
Yeah. So here's my question. Do you remember the first 2 points? Do you remember the 3 points that we talked about? No, this is for people listening, right? Okay. First one is simplify. Second one is visualize. And the third one is connect. So even though personally, I think getting messages that stick, that are interesting, that are authentic, that kind of message creation is probably the most important thing for a good speech. The thing that people worry about the most is delivering that speech, right? Because it's scary to deliver, and you're just not feeling all that confident. What are people going to think? I mean, there's so many different things going on. So we're not going to go too deep into like, here's 3 steps of how you can be a better speaker. Because I'll be honest, my whole thing is you need to figure out your style, your personality, and how you get better at delivery is you do it more often, right? The people who are the best speakers are the people who speak most often. And I remember early in my career, I was doing some public speaking, and I'm like, I want to get better at public speaking. So I watched, there's a speaker named Beth Moore, and she's a woman speaker, and she's from the South, and she's very good. I really liked her. It's like, I want to be like her. And I realized when I was giving my speeches after that, I started having a Southern accent every time I was speaking. It's like, wait a minute, I'm from Minnesota. I'm not Beth Moore. I'm Peggy. I'm different. Like, my speaking style is different. So I got to figure out what Peggy looks like giving a speech, not what Beth Moore looks like. So some ideas on.
Well, Peggy, real fast, preachers actually do that when they're learning to preach. They will have you take sermons of preachers, classic sermons, and there's stories of MLK in his preaching class. They would go over their professor's house on the weekend, and they would give famous speeches and famous sermons. And so one of the ways they talk about finding your voice is, it's like people talk about finding Forrester, and when, start writing and striking the keys and write in this, and then it'll bleed into yours and that kind of thing.
Oh, that's good.
But it's so you use these other talks, and then you start to find ones you identify with, and then you start to write in that voice, and then eventually you're writing in your own voice.
Yeah, that's really good. One of the things I think is important is how you start a presentation, the introduction, right? Because there's something in psychology called primacy recency. You remember the things you remember the most are the first things and the last things. So you really need to make sure that you craft your introduction. Don't just throw up the first slide full of bullet points and start on bullet point number 1. Figure out how to get people's attention, and then figure out how to make this relevant to people, right? So get their attention, make people sit up and say, oh, this is important for me. So a lot of times I tell people, especially if they're really nervous about giving a speech, start with a story, right? A story will get everybody's attention. People love stories. And when we're telling our own stories, there's something about our delivery that changes. It just becomes a little bit more relaxed because you're talking about you, right? And so that sometimes that can be a way to kind of get into a nervous situation and calm your nerves because you're talking about yourself. And then you get into more of the deeper content of what you're trying to do.
I love it. One of the things that I think is important too is seeking that feedback. How we're doing and that kind of stuff is the process. This is a process of growth. So when we're talking about those preachers, like even MLK learning to preach, it's how are we doing that in a context of trusted people that can give us that feedback. The other line about MLK was he got a B in his preaching class. And one of the stories they like to tell is he was a B preacher until he found a cause he could believe in. And I think that ties in with what you're saying, Peggy, on telling your own stories. There's a thing in storytelling where when you tell a story, you tell it different each time when it's you were actually there because you kind of remember different pieces. But I think that ties in that reality of we need to authentically show up as ourselves. You like the line, show up as yourself because everyone else is already taken. But it's this idea of people are going to know if you're being authentic and you're showing up as who you are, and they can connect with you if you're showing up as who you are. If you're trying to show up in a certain way, it usually doesn't work. Some other keys we like to talk about is after being authentically you is making eye contact. A lot of times, and I definitely did this a lot when I was learning to speak, you're nervous, and so you're tied to the talk. And so you end up reading the talk essentially and not being there and being present. And, I had a mentor that always say, you need to keep your chin up, or you need to look to the back of the room. We need to be hitting everyone with the eye contact. Another part of that is just being present in the space. A lot of times when we're nervous, we tend to go small and kind of draw back. And we need to have a presence. We need to project. We need to speak out. We need to hit, they say, hit the back of the room with your voice, that kind of stuff. The final thing on delivery, my boss would always tell me, if it doesn't matter to you, it won't matter to them. Why is this important to you? And let us see that. Otherwise, we're not really going to listen and care.
Oh, that's great.
But ironically, a lot of times we spend so much time on the content piece and we don't spend a lot of time thinking and practicing delivery. And a lot of great speakers will spend equal time on both. So they'll spend time creating the content, but then they'll spend as much time on how they're going to communicate that content. And a lot of times, like Peggy was saying before, this is the piece that people remember, right? A great line delivered poorly doesn't work. A decent line delivered well, people will remember that. So make sure you spend the time on the delivery.
Yeah. And a couple of other things that I tend to tell people that I coach and I work with. ground yourself. So this is an interesting thing. I was part of this group once, and they were like all into like, I don't know, yoga. I mean, just like different things. And they're like, all right, center your spirit and all this kind of stuff. And they would use this idea of ground yourself. And so I actually tried that. Not in a weird way before I started my speech, but I actually like put my feet on the ground and felt the ground. And you know what? It kind of helped me feel like I was present, like I'm there, right? It's like, this is actually helpful. And just that extra kind of big breath before I start, not like a, but, just kind of centering, ground yourself can really calm the nerves down, because for most of us, we get nervous at the beginning, but once we get into it, it's a lot better, right? So I always say, you got to figure out what you do when you get nervous. So you've probably already seen it in what we're doing today. When I get nervous, I tend to get like, what? My face is like weird, and I get like too excited. And but other people, when they get nervous, they might twist their legs. They might talk really fast. They might like talk really slow. Or just like shut down and be small. So you got to figure out what you do when you get nervous. Don't try and fix all of it all at once. Pick one thing that you can improve on. So for me, when I start and I'm particularly nervous, I say to myself, low and slow. I just have to calm myself down. I talk in a little lower pitch, and I just slow it down. And after the first minute or two, I'm good, right? So figure out kind of what you do when you get nervous. The manuscript can be, just like Matt said, it takes away from eye contact. And I know sometimes you need it, but connecting with your audience in a way that's you is so important. And then the last thing I want to really focus in on, because we're sort of running out of time here, is practicing. I get so frustrated. It's the best speakers that feel like they don't need to practice, and they end up giving some of the most boring speeches. And it's so frustrating, because when you practice, what happens is you hone your message, right? You get rid of the repetition, you get rid of all the extra words, you get rid of the stuff that really isn't that good. And if you can practice between 5 to 7 times, your presentation is going to be so much better. And when you get nervous, and it's like all of a sudden your mind just was like, totally forgot where I was. When you've practiced, you have that muscle memory, and you can just keep going. So,
well, I think with that, the intentional, like the feedback, kind of the idea on how we get better, practice and get feedback from trusted sources. So you're intentionally practicing on the improvement helps. The other piece I love for delivery, and it helps to ground me in the space like you're talking about, is that when I step up to speak, I'll take a moment to pause and look at the audience and take a short pause. And it allows me to get comfortable in the space, and it allows me to kind of visually engage with them.
right.
And then I like to practice specifically, I'll practice my opening and my ending. So I'm not tied to the page. I know where I am, and I can spend that time connecting with the people. And I've found that really, really helps me be grounded in the space.
Yeah. So one last thing I just wanted to share. It's one of those bullet points, suck your soul. That's my big thing. And nail the ending. So many people I work with, when they're done, they just stop talking. It's like, no, the ending is the most important piece. So figure out what your last 2 lines are, memorize them, and then nail them, right? So don't just whip through the last few lines like, I just want to get out of here. And just, so figure out what they are and nail the ending. See what I did there? I just nailed it.
Oh, I like it. So when you're focusing on talks, simplify, visualize, connect with your audience, and take time to practice. If you take some simple steps to make these changes, you'll see drastic outcomes with what you're doing and how you're engaging people and how comfortable you feel in the space. And one resource that we like to recommend is the Toastmasters. It's a great opportunity where you can get those reps with other people who are wanting more practice speaking.
All right. So that's all we have. Our time is up. Well, there's a little hand clapping. That's really nice. If you do have any questions or would like to just kind of talk about some of the things that you're thinking of, send us an email, because we love working with people, helping them become more effective in the ways that they communicate.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Peggy. It was great to be with you. Great to be with you all today. We appreciate it. We look forward to hearing you in the future.
Thank you.